Did you ever imagine that a prince could be removed from history without a single public announcement? No flashing headlines at first. No emergency broadcast. No dramatic statement read from a palace balcony. Just silence. And in that silence, something enormous happened. Because somewhere behind closed doors, far away from cameras and carefully managed smiles, Prince Harry reportedly realized that the one thing he had been born into, the line of succession, was no longer his. Not suspended. Not questioned. Gone. And the most unsettling part? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It wasn't a mob. It wasn't Parliament shouting him down. It wasn't the public demanding punishment. It was a decision shaped quietly, deliberately, and with devastating finality. So here's the question that should already be making you uneasy. How does a modern monarchy erase one of its most famous sons without ever saying the word removed? And more importantly, why now? Stay with me, because this story isn't about gossip. It isn't about tabloid drama. It's about power, tradition, fear, and the moment when emotion stops mattering because the institution decides it has something to protect. This is the story of how a prince went from spare to surplus, and why the throne, it turns out, was never meant for him. Let's start at the beginning. Not with the meeting, not with the dukes, not even with the king, but with the illusion most people still believe about royal succession. Because what you think you know is exactly what keeps you from seeing how this actually works. From the outside, royal succession looks simple, almost ceremonial. A neat list, passed down like an antique clock from one generation to the next. When one monarch dies, the next steps forward. Orderly, predictable, sacred. That's the story we're told. But inside the system, succession is not just inheritance. It's risk management. Every monarchy survives by anticipating disaster. What happens if the heir dies? What if the heir refuses duty? What if public trust collapses? What if scandal makes continuity dangerous? That's where the idea of the spare comes in. Prince Harry wasn't just born second. He was born insurance. From the moment he arrived, his role was defined not by possibility, but by contingency. If something happened to his brother, he would step in. If stability wavered, he would support. If the crown needed reinforcement, he was there. But here's the uncomfortable truth no palace guide will ever say out loud. The spare exists only as long as he remains safe for the institution. And safety, in royal terms, has nothing to do with affection. It has everything to do with predictability. Ask yourself this. How many times have you seen the monarchy tolerate unpredictability for long? They adapt. They modernize. They rebrand. But they do not gamble. Which brings us to why this moment matters now. Because the monarchy you see today is not the monarchy of Queen Elizabeth's era. The margin for error is thinner. The tolerance for controversy is lower. And the fear of destabilization is higher than it has been in decades. And at the center of that anxiety stands King Charles III, a man who waited a lifetime to inherit a crown he now has to protect at all costs. Charles inherited more than a throne. He inherited fragility, a public that questions relevance, a media ecosystem that feeds on fracture, a monarchy no longer shielded by unquestioned reverence. So when people ask, why would they do this now? The answer isn't emotional. It's strategic. Because from the institution's point of view, the line of succession isn't symbolic. It's a blueprint for survival. And any element that introduces instability becomes a liability. That's where the dukes enter the picture. And this is where the story starts to feel uncomfortable, because very few people understand who they really are. We're not talking about ceremonial titles worn at banquets. British dukes are landholders, power brokers, and custodians of tradition. Their influence doesn't come from popularity. It comes from permanence. These are families whose authority predates modern democracy. Their loyalty is not to individuals. It's to the crown as an idea. And when consensus forms among them, it is rarely impulsive. So imagine what it takes for 24 of them to align on one conclusion. Now imagine what that conclusion must have been. Because here's the contradiction that should make you pause. Prince Harry is one of the most recognizable royals on the planet. He brought global attention, youth appeal, and emotional connection to the monarchy. And yet, despite all of that, the institution appears to have decided that visibility was no longer an asset. It was a risk. Why? Because visibility invites scrutiny, and scrutiny invites challenge, and challenge threatens continuity. This is where the emotional part of the story collides with the brutal logic of monarchy. Harry didn't just step away from duties. He stepped outside the system's control. He spoke openly. He challenged narratives. He reframed loyalty as something conditional. And for an institution built on silence and hierarchy, that is not just uncomfortable, it's intolerable. Now, here's where things get especially painful. Because while the public argues about fairness, titles, and family drama, the machinery of monarchy doesn't operate on feelings. It operates on precedent. And precedent says that once a royal is perceived as destabilizing the narrative of unity, corrective action follows. Quietly, incrementally, irreversibly, not with a dramatic expulsion, but with procedural erosion. First, relevance is reduced. Then proximity is limited. Then influence disappears. And finally, the line moves on without you. That's why there was no announcement. Because announcing it would invite debate. And debate is dangerous. Instead, the system lets the change speak for itself. So picture the moment Harry understands what's happening. Not from a letter stamped with gold. Not from a public decree. But from the absence of reassurance. From the way conversations stop. From the way doors quietly close. From the realization that no one is correcting the assumption that he is no longer counted. That kind of realization doesn't arrive all at once. It sinks in slowly. And that's often the cruelest way. Ask yourself this. How would you feel if your entire identity, the one you never asked for but were born into, was removed without confrontation? Not argued over. Not fought for. Just accepted by everyone else as necessary. Because that's the part that cuts deepest. Not the decision, but the consensus. And that's why this story resonates beyond royalty. It's about what happens when institutions outgrow individuals. When loyalty becomes irrelevant. When history decides that continuity matters more than compassion. And we're only just getting started. Because if the introduction tells us what happened, the next chapter asks a far more dangerous question. Was Prince Harry ever truly in line for the throne? Or was his removal simply the final confirmation of a role that was never meant to last? Was Prince Harry ever truly in line for the throne? Or was his removal simply the final confirmation of a role that was never meant to last? That question sounds provocative, almost cruel, but it's the only place this story can honestly go next. Because before there were dukes in a room, before there were quiet approvals and strategic silences, before there was a realization that something irreversible had happened, there was a boy born into a system that had already decided exactly how far he could go, and no further. Let's talk about the word everyone uses, but almost no one understands. Spare. It sounds harmless, doesn't it? Almost affectionate. Like a backup plan, just in case. A second chance. A safety net. But inside the monarchy, spare doesn't mean equal. It doesn't mean alternative. It doesn't even mean potential. It means conditional. A spare exists only to protect the heir, to stabilize the crown, to absorb risk so the institution doesn't have to. And once that purpose is fulfilled, or worse, compromised, the spare becomes expendable. From the moment Prince Harry was born, the structure of his life was already mapped out. Not by dreams, not by ambition, but by contingency planning. William was the future. Harry was the buffer. That distinction might seem subtle to the public, but within royal culture, it is everything. Because while the heir is raised with inevitability, the spare is raised with limits. Limits on authority, limits on expectation, limits on how seriously they will ever be taken. And here's the contradiction that defines Harry's entire life. The spare is raised close enough to power to taste it, but never close enough to own it. That creates something dangerous. Resentment? Maybe. Confusion? Absolutely. But more than anything, identity fracture. Ask yourself this. Who are you, really, when your entire purpose is tied to someone else's survival? That question haunts spares long before they ever realize it. And history is full of them. Look back through royal lineages, and you'll notice a pattern. Second sons are celebrated in childhood. Charismatic. Relatable. Often more emotionally expressive than heirs. The public loves them. But as adulthood approaches, something changes. The tolerance fades. Because adulthood is when agency begins. And agency is dangerous when it doesn't align with the crown's priorities. Harry's early life fit the spare template perfectly. He was the fun one, the relatable one, the emotional one. He drew sympathy. He drew affection. He humanized the monarchy at a time when it desperately needed warmth. But that warmth came at a cost. Because the more emotionally resonant the spare becomes, the more threatening he is to the hierarchy. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Monarchies don't just manage bloodlines. They manage optics. And optics demand contrast. The air must appear stable, serious, inevitable. The spare can be charming, but not commanding. Supportive, but not central. Visible, but never dominant. So when Harry's popularity surged, it wasn't celebrated behind palace walls. It was monitored. This is the part of the story people don't like to hear, because it clashes with the fairy tale. We want to believe family comes first, that brothers support each other, that the system protects its own. But the monarchy doesn't function like a family. It functions like a corporation with a 1,000-year brand to protect. And brands don't tolerate internal competition. That's why spares across history have been quietly redirected. Military careers, charitable roles, overseas postings, all respectable, all purposeful, all carefully designed to keep them useful without making them influential. Harry followed that path at first. Service, duty, public goodwill. But then something happened that the system could not fully control. He began to speak, not just in speeches, not just in rehearsed statements, but emotionally, personally, authentically. And authenticity is dangerous in a system built on ambiguity. Think about it. The monarchy survives because it reveals just enough and conceals the rest. It allows the public to project meaning onto silence. But when someone inside the system starts narrating their own experience, the spell breaks. Harry didn't just exist as a spare. He interpreted it. He put words to isolation. He described grief without filters. He reframed duty as something that should not require emotional sacrifice without consent. To the public, that sounded brave. To the institution, it sounded like a warning siren. Because once a spare reframes their role as optional, or worse, negotiable, the entire hierarchy begins to wobble. And this is where the idea that Harry was removed from succession becomes misleading. Because in many ways, he began removing himself long before anyone else made a move. Not deliberately, not strategically, but philosophically. He stopped treating the crown as destiny and started treating it as a burden that required justification. And the monarchy does not negotiate with that mindset. Let's be honest about something most people avoid saying. The line of succession is not about merit. It's not about likability. And it's definitely not about fairness. It's about predictability. William's greatest strength, from the institution's point of view, is not charisma or popularity. It's restraint. Restraint in speech. Restraint in emotion. Restraint in personal narrative. That restraint makes him safe. Harry's openness made him volatile. Not dangerous in a malicious sense, but destabilizing in a symbolic one. Now here's where the illusion really collapses. Most people assume succession is immutable, that unless Parliament intervenes or abdication occurs, the list is fixed. That's not entirely true. The list is public, but the legitimacy behind it is contextual. Support matters. Endorsement matters. Consensus matters. And that's where the spare's position becomes especially fragile. Because the spare is only valuable as long as the system believes they would protect continuity if needed. The moment doubt enters that equation, the spare transforms from insurance into risk. Ask yourself this question carefully. If something had happened to William at the height of Harry's public descent, would the monarchy have felt secure with Harry stepping forward? Or would it have felt exposed? That question alone explains more than any rumor ever could. Because succession planning isn't about what is likely. It's about what cannot be allowed. And from the institution's point of view, a future where Harry represented the crown was no longer unthinkable. It was unacceptable. This is why there was no dramatic rupture at first. No titles stripped overnight. No thunderous announcements. Because institutions don't amputate immediately. They withdraw support gradually and watch what happens. They see whether the individual adapts, whether they recalibrate, whether they return to alignment. And when that doesn't happen, consensus forms. Not out of spite. Out of self-preservation. Which brings us back to the core question of this chapter. Was Harry ever truly in line for the throne? Technically, yes. Structurally? only under very specific conditions. Conditions that required silence, compliance, and an acceptance of being secondary forever. The moment Harry challenged that framework, emotionally, publicly, philosophically, his position shifted. Not because he was punished, but because he no longer fit the role he was designed to play. And here's the part that makes this story tragic rather than scandalous. Harry didn't fail the monarchy. The monarchy outgrew him. Or perhaps more accurately, it could no longer afford him. Because institutions don't ask whether someone deserves exclusion. They ask whether inclusion is too costly. And when the cost becomes unpredictable, the decision becomes inevitable. So when people say they removed him from the succession, they're only seeing the final frame of a much longer process. The truth is far colder. Harry was never being moved backward. He was being allowed to drift out of relevance. And once relevance is gone, removal becomes a formality. But here's where the story takes a turn that most people never anticipate. Because if Harry's role as spare was always conditional, then the real shock isn't that he was removed. It's who finally decided the conditions had been violated. And why that decision didn't come from where you think it did. Because next, we need to talk about the succession list itself, and the hidden power structure that quietly determines who belongs on it. That's where the Dukes come in. And once you understand their role, you'll realize something unsettling. This was never just a family decision. Who actually decides who belongs on the line of succession? That question sounds almost naive. Most people assume they already know the answer. Birth order. Law. A list printed neatly on official websites. Simple. But if it were really that simple, nothing you're watching unfold right now would make sense. Because the line of succession is not just a list. It's a living framework, shaped, protected, and quietly enforced by people you almost never hear about. And once you understand that, the idea that Prince Harry could be eased out without a dramatic legal battle starts to feel far less shocking and far more inevitable. Let's dismantle the illusion carefully. On paper, succession looks rigid. It appears locked in by centuries of law, reinforced by acts of parliament, and guarded by constitutional tradition. Names move only when births, deaths, or abdications occur. That's what the public sees. But behind that public-facing structure exists something else entirely. A consensus system. Because monarchy does not survive on legality alone. It survives on legitimacy. And legitimacy is not enforced by ink on parchment. It is maintained by alignment among power holders. Here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. The monarchy has always relied on elite agreement to function smoothly. Not democracy, not popularity, agreement. The crown exists because enough powerful people believe it should exist, support it, and protect it from fracture. That belief is fragile. And the line of succession is where that fragility becomes most dangerous. Why? Because succession is the future made visible. It tells elites, institutions, and even foreign governments who will eventually hold symbolic authority. It signals continuity, stability, predictability. Anything that introduces uncertainty into that signal sends alarm bells ringing. So when people ask, can someone really be removed from succession without Parliament stepping in? They're asking the wrong question. The real question is this: can someone remain meaningfully supported in succession once elite confidence collapses? And the answer is no. Not sustainably, not quietly, not without consequences. This is where we need to talk about the difference between being listed and being viable. You can be named on paper and still be functionally unacceptable. And when that happens, systems adapt. Not by tearing down the law, but by sidelining relevance. That's how institutions protect themselves without provoking backlash. So let's talk about the group most people never factor into this equation. The Dukes. Not celebrity dukes. Not ceremonial figureheads. We're talking about Britain's senior aristocracy. Landholders whose families have outlasted governments, wars, revolutions, and monarchs. These are not influencers. They don't speak often. They don't need to. Their power is not loud. It's structural. For centuries, dukes have functioned as stabilizers of the crown. They sit at the intersection of tradition, wealth, land, and loyalty. Their estates anchor local economies. Their families anchor continuity. And crucially, they are invested in a monarchy that does not surprise them. Surprise is instability. And instability is threat. This is why the idea of 24 British dukes Consensus did not emerge because of one interview, or one speech, or one decision. It formed because a pattern became impossible to ignore. Harry wasn't unpredictable in bursts. He was unpredictable in principle. He challenged narratives rather than reinforcing them. He reframed loyalty as mutual rather than hierarchical. He treated duty as something that required emotional consent. Those ideas resonate deeply with the public. They terrify institutions. Because institutions are not built on consent. They are built on obligation. Now ask yourself something honestly. If you were a duke whose family had aligned itself with the crown for centuries, whose wealth, relevance, and identity were intertwined with the monarchy's survival, how would you react to a potential future king who openly questioned the structure itself? Not maliciously, not rebelliously, but philosophically. That's not a personal threat. That's an existential one. And this is where the succession list stops being a neutral document and starts functioning like a risk register. Every name on that list is evaluated not just for legality, but for compatibility. Compatibility with silence. Compatibility with restraint. Compatibility with being a symbol rather than a narrator. This is why Harry's position weakened long before any supposed removal. Because the moment elite confidence fades, influence drains away. You stop being consulted. You stop being positioned. You stop being factored into future planning. And once planning moves on without you, the list becomes symbolic rather than real. That's why there was no dramatic announcement. Because from the system's point of view, nothing dramatic happened. A future scenario was quietly ruled out. And that's the part people struggle to accept. Harry didn't have to be formally expelled to be effectively excluded. He only had to become unacceptable as a future option. Now let's bring King Charles III into this moment, because his role here is deeply misunderstood. Charles is often framed as the architect of this outcome, but that framing gives him too much individual power. Kings do not act alone when it comes to succession viability. They listen, they measure mood, they assess alignment. Charles inherited a monarchy in a delicate phase. One wrong move could fracture public trust or provoke constitutional debate. Stability is not a luxury for him. It's a mandate. So when consensus begins forming around concern, a king doesn't argue emotionally. He calculates. And calculation leads to containment. That containment doesn't look like punishment. It looks like distance, less involvement, less visibility, less institutional reinforcement. Until one day, the realization hits. You are still a prince, but you are no longer part of the future. That realization is devastating precisely because it arrives without confrontation. No one says, "You're out." They simply stop saying, "You're in." And that silence carries more weight than any declaration. This is why people searching for a single moment, a single meeting where Harry was removed, are misunderstanding the nature of power. Power doesn't announce itself when it withdraws. It recedes. And when it's gone, the absence is unmistakable. But here's the twist most people don't see coming. Because if dukes quietly aligned, and if the monarchy recalibrated its future without Harry, then the most painful question isn't about legality. It's about timing. Why did this alignment solidify when it did? Why not earlier? Why not later? And what exactly happened to tip consensus into certainty? Because institutions don't act until they believe delay is more dangerous than action, which means something occurred, something subtle, something cumulative. That convinced powerful people the risk had crossed a threshold. And once that threshold was crossed, there was no going back. Next, we need to talk about the moment that changed the conversation behind palace walls. The moment when concern turned into resolve. And the people in the room when it happened. Because the meeting that followed didn't look dramatic from the outside. But inside, it changed everything. What actually happens in a room where history is rewritten? Without ink, without signatures, and without anyone raising their voice. Because that's the moment we're approaching now. The moment when concern stopped being theoretical. When doubts stopped being private. When uncertainty hardened into resolve. This is the part of the story most people imagine incorrectly. They picture shouting, arguments, ultimatums. But power rarely sounds like that. Power sounds calm, measured, almost polite. And that's what makes it terrifying. Because when decisions are made quietly, there is no appeal. Let's talk about the meeting. Not as a dramatic showdown, but as an inflection point. A convergence of people who had already been thinking the same thing, and finally realized they were no longer thinking alone. By the time this meeting occurred, the groundwork had already been laid. Years of observation, years of internal conversations, years of watching patterns repeat. The room didn't need convincing. It needed confirmation. This is crucial to understand. Institutions do not convene meetings to debate ideas that are still fluid. They convene meetings when they believe consensus already exists and want to formalize it without provoking resistance. So when people ask, was this the moment Harry was removed? They're asking the wrong question again. This was the moment everyone acknowledged that the future no longer included him. Let's slow this down. Imagine the atmosphere. No press, no leaks, no dramatic agenda. Just experienced power holders, people whose families have navigated monarchy for generations, sitting in quiet alignment. They weren't there to discuss personality. They weren't there to litigate grievances. They were there to assess risk. And risk, in this context, meant one thing: uncertainty. The concern wasn't that Prince Harry had opinions. It was that he articulated them publicly. It wasn't that he challenged tradition. It was that he reframed it in moral terms. Institutions can adapt to rebellion. They cannot adapt to moral redefinition. Because once duty is reframed as optional or conditional, the entire hierarchy begins to erode. So the conversation didn't begin with, what do we do about Harry? It began with, what happens if the unexpected occurs? What if the line shifts suddenly? What if tragedy strikes? What if continuity depends on someone who no longer accepts the premises of the institution? That's not a personal question. That's a structural one. And structural questions demand structural answers. Here's something most people don't realize. Elite consensus doesn't require unanimity. It requires silence from dissenters. And silence is easier to achieve when resistance feels futile. By the time this meeting happened, resistance had already softened. Not because people were cruel, but because they were tired. Tired of recalibrating messaging. Tired of explaining contradictions. Tired of defending unpredictability. Institutions value reliability above all else. And the moment reliability is questioned, loyalty becomes conditional. Now let's talk about King Charles III, because his position in this moment is often misunderstood. Charles was not the driving force. He was the fulcrum. He didn't initiate consensus. He responded to it. That distinction matters, because it means the decision wasn't emotional. It was administrative. Charles's role wasn't to argue whether this was fair. It was to determine whether delay would be more dangerous than acceptance. And that is the loneliest position of power, because once a king recognizes that elite confidence is shifting, he has two options: resist and fracture alignment, or absorb and preserve stability. Kings who resist elite consensus rarely reign peacefully. History is not kind to them. So Charles listened. And listening, in this context, meant something chilling. It meant accepting that the institution no longer felt safe with Harry as a potential future symbol. Not because Harry was malicious, but because he was incompatible with the role as it was defined. Now let's pause here and ask something uncomfortable. Would Harry have wanted that role anyway? The irony is painful, because by the time the institution decided it could not include him, Harry himself had already expressed ambivalence toward the very framework that defined succession. That's what makes this moment tragic rather than villainous. Two sides drifting apart, not out of hatred, but out of irreconcilable worldviews. And yet, only one side has the power to finalize separation. That's how institutions work. Now imagine what it's like for the person not in the room. Because Harry was not present. He wasn't consulted. He wasn't invited to defend his position. And that absence tells you everything you need to know. This was not a negotiation. It was a recognition. And recognition doesn't require participation from the recognized. By the time consensus reaches that stage, the subject is no longer part of the process. They're the outcome. Here's where the emotional weight hits hardest. Because Harry likely sensed the shift before he ever understood it. Phone calls change tone. Invitations slow. Reassurances stop arriving. No one says, "You've lost support." They simply stop providing it. And silence, when you're inside a system built on signals, is deafening. Ask yourself this. How would you process realizing that your future had been decided without you? That your relevance had expired? Quietly, politely, efficiently? This is why there were no headlines at first. Because from the institution's perspective, nothing dramatic had occurred. A scenario had been eliminated. a variable removed, a risk mitigated. And that brings us to the phrase that changes everything. Succession viability. You can remain on a list and still be considered non-viable. You can hold a title and still be excluded from planning. You can be loved by the public and still be unacceptable to the institution. And once you are deemed non-viable, the rest is procedural. Now here's the twist most people don't anticipate. The meeting didn't end with relief. It ended with discomfort, because everyone in that room understood the human cost of what had just been acknowledged. This wasn't triumph. It was necessity, and necessity is a cold companion. But institutions don't mourn. They move forward. And when they do so with unsettling speed. Plans adjust. Narratives recalibrate. The future realigns. And suddenly, the absence feels permanent. But Harry didn't find out that day. He found out gradually, in the way he wasn't referenced, in the way succession conversations skipped his name, in the way reassurance was replaced by vagueness. And that kind of realization doesn't explode. It sinks, slowly, painfully, until one day, you understand something that can't be undone. You were never pushed out. You were allowed to become irrelevant. And relevance, once lost, is never restored in systems like this. But we're not done. Because while this meeting marked the internal turning point, the external consequences were only just beginning. And the next phase of this story is where emotion finally collides with reality. Because at some point, silence breaks. At some point, realization becomes reaction. And when that happens, the fallout doesn't stay contained. Next, we need to talk about the moment Harry understood, truly understood, what had happened. Not through rumor, not through speculation, but through confirmation that could not be ignored. Because when that moment arrived, it changed him. And what came next would ripple far beyond palace walls. When does suspicion become certainty? Not when someone tells you outright. Not when a headline screams it. Not even when the rumors grow louder. Certainty arrives when reassurance disappears. That's the moment Prince Harry reached. The moment when denial could no longer protect him, and hope stopped doing its job. Because here's the truth most people don't want to face. No one sat Harry down and said, "You're out." There was no formal letter, no confrontation, no final conversation with dramatic words and trembling hands. What there was absence. And absence is far more brutal. Let's talk about how realization actually happens inside elite systems. It doesn't arrive as a shockwave. It arrives as erosion. The first sign is subtle. A question that doesn't get answered. A meeting that never gets scheduled. A reassurance that sounds vague instead of firm. At first, you tell yourself you're imagining it. You rationalize. They're busy. Timing is off. The press cycle is intense. You wait. Then more signals vanish. You're no longer looped in. You hear about decisions after they're made. Names are mentioned, except yours. And that's when the thought creeps in. Something has changed, but you still resist it. Because believing otherwise would mean accepting something devastating. That you are no longer part of the future. Harry's realization didn't happen in one dramatic hour. It unfolded across weeks, maybe months, as patterns emerged that could no longer be dismissed. The monarchy is a language of cues. Who stands where? Who speaks when? Who is mentioned, and who is not? When your name stops appearing in those quiet signals, it means something fundamental has shifted. And this is where the emotional toll becomes unbearable. Because Harry didn't just lose a role. He lost a narrative he had lived inside since birth. Imagine growing up knowing your life was defined by a system you didn't choose, and then realizing that system has quietly moved on without you. That's not rejection. That's erasure. Now pause for a second and ask yourself something honestly. Which would hurt more? Being told directly, you're no longer wanted? Or realizing no one feels the need to tell you anything at all? Because the second option carries a message far colder. It says, your reaction no longer matters. And that's what Harry began to understand. At some point, something happened that crystallized it. Not a headline, not a leak, but confirmation by behavior. Succession conversations surfaced, and his name wasn't part of them. Not even hypothetically, not even defensively, just skipped. That's when the illusion shattered. Because even if you've stepped back from duty, even if you've questioned the institution, there's still an assumption that your existence within it remains acknowledged. Harry discovered that assumption was false. And that discovery changes everything. Think about the psychological impact. This wasn't about ambition. It wasn't about wanting the throne. It was about identity, about being told, without words, that the role written into your DNA no longer applies, that the story you were born into has been edited, and you didn't make the cut. That kind of realization doesn't trigger rage first. It triggers disbelief. Surely there's a misunderstanding. Surely someone will clarify. Surely this will be corrected. So you wait, and nothing happens. That's when disbelief turns into grief. Because grief isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet resignation. The moment you stop asking questions. The moment you realize answers won't come. And this is where people misunderstand Harry's emotional response. They expect anger. They expect retaliation. They expect a dramatic outburst. But the first response was silence. Because silence is what happens when the weight is too heavy to articulate. Harry wasn't just processing exclusion. He was processing finality. There's a specific kind of pain that comes with realizing something cannot be reversed. Not because it's illegal, not because it's impossible, but because no one wants it reversed. And that's the part that breaks you. Ask yourself this. How do you argue for relevance when the people who once needed you no longer see a use for you? You can't. You can only accept it, or burn everything down. And Harry didn't do the latter. At least not immediately. Instead, he did something far more human. He mourned. Not publicly, not performatively, internally. Because the realization didn't just strip him of a future possibility. It reframed his entire past. Moments that once felt meaningful now felt transactional. Support that once felt genuine now felt conditional. Was he ever valued, or merely tolerated? That question haunts anyone who realizes their worth was tied to utility. And for Harry, utility had expired. Now let's talk about the tears. Not the dramatic kind tabloids love to imagine, but the private kind. The kind that come when you finally stop pretending you're okay. When you're alone. When no one is watching. When you're forced to confront the fact that the system you defended, even as you criticized it, no longer defends you at all. That's when emotion catches up. Not rage. Not vengeance. Loss. Because despite everything, Harry still belonged to that world. And losing belonging is devastating. Even when you've chosen distance. This is the contradiction that makes his story so difficult to reduce to villains and heroes. He questioned the monarchy, but he was still shaped by it. He stepped away, but he didn't stop caring. And the monarchy, for its part, didn't attack him. It simply moved on, which is far worse. Because moving on suggests closure. And Harry wasn't given any. Now here's where things get darker. Because once realization sets in, it doesn't stay contained. It leaks. Into relationships. Into trust. Into how you interpret every interaction that follows. You start reading between lines that never needed reading before. You start wondering who knew, and when. Who supported you, and who quietly withdrew. That kind of mental unraveling doesn't resolve quickly. It lingers. And it reshapes behavior. This is why Harry's next moves felt different. More guarded. More deliberate. Less hopeful. Because once you realize the institution has finished with you, every remaining interaction becomes suspect. Is this courtesy or pity? Is this contact or obligation? And that uncertainty is exhausting. Now let's address something uncomfortable. Could Harry have prevented this? That question assumes the decision was responsive. It wasn't. By the time realization reached him, the decision had already calcified. Because institutions don't wait for reactions. They finalize before reactions can interfere. So even if Harry had recalibrated, retreated, or rephrased himself, the door was already closed. Not slammed. Closed. And locked by consensus. That's why the realization hurt so deeply. Because it wasn't a consequence of one mistake. It was the result of cumulative incompatibility. And cumulative incompatibility is impossible to undo. You can apologize for an action. You cannot apologize for who you are. And who Harry had become. Openly expressive, morally assertive, emotionally transparent, no longer fit the crown's requirements. So when the tears came, they weren't just about loss. They were about acceptance. Acceptance that the story had ended, without his input. Acceptance that the institution would continue, without him. Acceptance that the throne was not just unavailable. It was no longer imaginable. And that realization didn't free him. It wounded him. Because freedom that comes from rejection doesn't feel like freedom at all. It feels like exile. But the story doesn't end with tears. If it had been personal, there could have been dialogue. If it had been emotional, there could have been reconciliation. But this was procedural, and procedural decisions don't reverse themselves. The explanation didn't sound like punishment. It sounded like inevitability. And that's the kind of reasoning you can't argue with. Because how do you defend yourself against the claim that you are no longer compatible with a system that refuses to adapt to you? You don't. You absorb it. Now imagine how that lands emotionally. Because to Harry, this wasn't just about alignment with the crown. It was about alignment with values he believed were human. Compassion, transparency, boundaries. The very traits that made him relatable to millions were reframed as liabilities behind palace walls. Not because they were wrong, but because they were uncontrollable. This is where the contradiction becomes unbearable. The monarchy relies on public trust, yet fears public honesty. It values emotional connection, yet punishes emotional disclosure. And Harry sat at the center of that contradiction. He was told, implicitly, that the institution didn't doubt his sincerity. It doubted his restraint. And restraint is the monarchy's most prized currency. Here's what makes the explanation cut so deeply. It wasn't about what Harry had done. It was about what he might do, about future uncertainty, about the risk that under pressure, he might speak again. Candidly, emotionally, unscripted. From the institution's point of view, that was unacceptable. From Harry's point of view, that was who he was. So the reason wasn't framed as exclusion. It was framed as incompatibility, which is a far more final judgment. Because incompatibility implies permanence. It suggests that no apology would suffice. No adjustment would restore trust. No compromise would satisfy concern. It says, the problem is not behavior, it's essence. And that's devastating to hear, even indirectly. Especially when the essence in question is your humanity. Now ask yourself something honestly. If you were told that your core traits, your emotional openness, your willingness to speak truthfully, your refusal to suppress pain, were incompatible with the role you were born into, would you feel ashamed or betrayed? Because Harry likely felt both. Ashamed that what made him himself was now framed as a flaw. Betrayed that the institution he had defended demanded emotional silence as the price of belonging. This is why the explanation hurt more than the removal itself. Because removal ends a chapter. But explanation reframes your entire identity. It forces you to reevaluate every moment that came before. Were they proud of me, or merely managing me? Did they support me, or tolerate me? Was I valued, or simply useful? Those questions don't resolve easily. They linger. And they poison trust permanently. This is also why public narratives fail to capture the truth of this moment. People argue about fairness, titles, legalities. But none of that touches the emotional core. Because Harry wasn't grieving loss of power. He was grieving loss of acceptance. And acceptance, once withdrawn, cannot be negotiated back through logic. Now here's where things become even more complicated. Because while Harry was absorbing this explanation, this quiet justification, the institution was already moving forward, adjusting narratives, reinforcing succession clarity, recentering stability. The explanation wasn't meant to comfort him. It was meant to close the file. And once the file is closed, institutions don't revisit it. That's how they survive. Which brings us to another uncomfortable realization. The explanation was never meant for Harry alone. It was meant to be repeated. To dukes, to advisors, to anyone who asked, quietly, why his relevance had faded. And because it sounded reasonable, alignment, stability, predictability, it spread easily. No outrage, no controversy, just acceptance. And acceptance is the most dangerous force in elite systems. Because once something is accepted, it becomes normalized. And once it's normalized, it becomes invisible. Harry didn't just lose a place. He lost the argument. Because the institution had already framed the narrative in a way that didn't require debate. He was no longer aligned. Case closed. Now let's talk about the emotional aftermath of hearing, or sensing, that explanation. Because once you understand that the decision isn't about reconciliation, your mindset changes. You stop hoping. You stop waiting. You stop imagining paths back. And that's when grief gives way to clarity. Clarity is not comforting. It's sobering. It tells you that the door wasn't slammed. It was sealed. And sealed doors don't respond to knocking. This is why Harry's subsequent silence wasn't weakness. It was recalibration. He wasn't deciding whether to fight back. He was deciding whether to keep protecting an institution that had stopped protecting him. And that's a moral crossroads few people ever face. Do you preserve the dignity of a system that has quietly discarded you? Or do you reclaim your voice, knowing it will deepen the divide? Harry didn't rush that decision, because he understood the cost. Once you speak after erasure, you don't just burn bridges. You confirm fears. And those fears, unpredictability, emotional candor, refusal to conform, were exactly what the institution had cited as justification. So silence, for a time, was strategic. But silence cannot last forever. Because explanations don't stay contained. They echo. They reshape how you're treated, how you're spoken about, how you're remembered. And at some point, you realize that staying silent doesn't preserve your dignity. It erodes it. That's when the next phase begins. Not revenge, not retaliation, but disengagement. And disengagement is the most dangerous thing an institution can provoke. Because once someone disengages emotionally, they stop safeguarding the narrative. They stop filtering their truth. They stop prioritizing stability over honesty. And honesty, in systems built on controlled ambiguity, is explosive. So while the explanation was meant to finalize Harry's exclusion, it also set something else in motion. A shift from grief to resolve, from silence to boundaries, from belonging to autonomy. And autonomy is the one thing monarchy cannot absorb without consequence. Because monarchy demands submission to continuity. Autonomy demands self-definition. Those two forces cannot coexist peacefully, which is why what came next was inevitable. Because once Harry understood the reason, he stopped asking for acceptance. And when someone stops asking, they start speaking differently. Next, we need to talk about what happened when silence could no longer hold. When public restraint met private clarity. When disengagement turned into action. Because the fallout from that shift didn't stay personal. It spilled into the public sphere. And when it did, it forced the institution into a position it fears most. Visibility. What happens when someone stops trying to belong? Not when they lash out, not when they threaten, but when they quietly withdraw their emotional labor. Because that's the moment institutions fear most. Silence, when chosen, is no longer compliance. It's autonomy. And autonomy is radioactive inside systems built on controlled ambiguity. This is the phase of the story where many people get it wrong. They expect fireworks. They expect confrontation. They expect an open war. But what actually happened next was far more unsettling. Harry didn't erupt. He recalibrated. And recalibration is what turns a personal rupture into an institutional problem. Let's slow this down, because the shift wasn't loud. It was deliberate. Once the explanation had settled, once it became clear that misalignment wasn't a phase but a verdict, Harry stopped waiting for signals. No more reading between lines. No more hoping tone would change. No more imagining paths back. That hope had been doing more damage than the truth. So he let it go. And when someone raised inside a rigid hierarchy lets go of hope, something fundamental changes. They stop filtering themselves for approval. They stop anticipating how their words will be interpreted by power. They stop carrying the emotional burden of preserving an institution's image. And that's when silence transforms. Before, silence was restraint. Now, silence was preparation. Because here's the uncomfortable reality. Harry didn't owe the institution anything anymore. Not loyalty, not protection, not narrative management. Those obligations only exist as long as belonging exists. Once belonging is withdrawn, obligation dissolves with it. And this is where the monarchy's greatest miscalculation becomes visible. They believed exclusion would neutralize risk. Instead, it removed containment. Because when someone no longer sees themselves as part of the system, they stop absorbing its shocks. They stop cushioning its contradictions. They stop softening its edges for the sake of unity. And unity, without willing participants, is a performance. Now think about what this meant internally. For years, Harry had acted as a pressure valve. He absorbed criticism. He carried emotional narratives. He humanized trauma in a way the monarchy could not. That role benefited the institution, even as it strained him personally. But once that role ended, the institution lost more than a spare. It lost a buffer. And buffers are invisible until they're gone. This is where disengagement becomes dangerous. Because disengagement isn't rebellion. It's withdrawal of consent. And systems built on tradition rather than consent don't know how to respond to that. They know how to punish. They know how to silence. They know how to distance. But they don't know how to interact with someone who no longer needs them emotionally. That creates unpredictability. And unpredictability is the one thing the monarchy cannot tolerate. So while Harry was recalibrating privately, the institution began noticing something unsettling. He wasn't reacting the way they expected. No desperate outreach. No public pleading. No attempts at reconciliation. Just boundaries. Clear ones. That shift forced a reevaluation. Because boundaries change dynamics. When someone sets them, they're no longer asking permission. They're asserting agency. An agency from within the royal orbit is disruptive by definition. Now let's talk about the internal panic this caused. Not publicly, but strategically. Because institutions don't fear anger as much as they fear indifference. Anger can be discredited. Anger can be framed as instability. Anger can be waited out. Indifference cannot. Indifference says, you no longer matter to my sense of self. And once someone reaches that point, leverage evaporates. Harry's disengagement signaled something dangerous. He was no longer invested in preserving appearances. That didn't mean he was plotting retaliation. It meant he was no longer editing himself to protect the crown. And for an institution that relies on silence and implication, unfiltered truth is existentially threatening. This is where the public-private divide becomes crucial. Privately, Harry was coming to terms with finality. Publicly, the institution was still trying to manage perception. Those two timelines were no longer aligned. And misaligned timelines always collide. Because public narratives can't outrun private clarity forever. Now consider the psychological shift. When someone feels erased, they often respond in one of two ways. They try harder to be seen, or they stop trying entirely. Harry chose the second, and that choice changed everything. Because once you stop trying to be seen by an institution, you begin seeing it more clearly. You notice patterns you once rationalized. You question motives you once excused. You reinterpret moments you once minimized. The spell breaks. And once it does, there's no returning to innocence. This is why disengagement isn't passive. It's transformative. It reorients power. Because power depends on belief. And Harry no longer believed in the story the monarchy needed him to uphold. Now here's where the narrative gets especially uncomfortable. Because disengagement doesn't just affect the person who disengages. It destabilizes everyone around them. People begin to wonder, what does he know? What might he say? What might he refuse to say? Silence becomes suspicious, not because it's hostile, but because it's uncontrolled. And that's when institutions make a mistake. They assume silence equals compliance. They assume disengagement equals retreat. But disengagement is often the prelude to redefinition. Because once someone stops orienting themselves around an institution, they start orienting around themselves. And self-definition is the one thing monarchy cannot absorb without damage. Why? Because monarchy survives by defining others. Roles, titles, expectations. When someone reclaims that authority for themselves, the hierarchy cracks. Harry wasn't positioning himself as an alternative to the crown. He was positioning himself outside of it. And that distinction matters. Opposition invites defense. Exit invites exposure. Because exits provoke questions. Why did he leave? What did he see? What did the institution lose? Those questions linger. And institutions hate lingering questions. So while Harry was disengaging, the institution began doing something else. It tightened control elsewhere, clarified succession messaging, reinforced hierarchy, closed ranks, not out of malice, out of fear. Fear that autonomy would inspire scrutiny. Fear that disengagement would invite sympathy. Fear that silence would be interpreted as moral high ground. And fear, when paired with power, leads to containment strategies. Which brings us to the next phase of this story. Because disengagement doesn't stay private forever. At some point, boundaries must be explained. At some point, silence invites speculation. And at some point, the narrative vacuum becomes too large to ignore. Harry didn't speak immediately. But when he did begin to articulate his position, carefully, deliberately, on his own terms, it forced the institution into an impossible position. Respond and validate relevance. Ignore and appear evasive. Either option carried risk. And that's the moment when disengagement stops being personal and becomes political. Because once a former insider speaks from outside the system, the story changes. It's no longer about grievance. It's about exposure. And exposure is what institutions fear most. Because exposure doesn't require accusation. It only requires perspective. Next, we need to talk about the moment silence gave way to voice. Not as an attack, but as an assertion. The moment Harry stopped managing the monarchy's image and started managing his own truth. Because when that line was crossed, there was no going back. And what followed would force the institution to reveal something it had tried desperately to avoid. Its vulnerability. What happens when silence finally breaks? Not in anger, but in clarity? Because that moment doesn't sound like an explosion. It sounds like resolve. And resolve is far more dangerous to institutions than rage ever could be. This is the point in the story where the balance shifts. Not because Harry decided to attack. Not because he wanted revenge. But because he stopped protecting a narrative that had already discarded him. Once disengagement solidifies, the next step is inevitable. Explanation. Not to the institution. Not to power. But to the world. And here's the crucial distinction most people miss. Harry didn't begin speaking to regain relevance. He began speaking because relevance no longer mattered. That's what changed everything. When someone still wants to belong, they measure every word. When someone no longer wants entry, they speak differently. Carefully, but freely. That difference is seismic. Because institutions rely on one unspoken rule above all others. Insiders don't explain the system. They perform it. The moment an insider steps outside and starts describing how the system actually feels from within, the spell weakens. And that's exactly what began to happen. Not all at once. Not recklessly. Gradually. Deliberately. Harry didn't come out swinging. He didn't accuse the monarchy of conspiracy or cruelty. That would have been easy to dismiss. Instead, he did something far more destabilizing. He told his story as a human one. And human stories are hard to neutralize. Because they don't challenge power directly. They invite the audience to draw conclusions on their own. That's what made the shift so dangerous. Harry wasn't framing himself as a victim of punishment. He was framing himself as someone who had reached the end of a role that no longer allowed him to exist authentically. And authenticity, in this context, became a weapon, not because it was aggressive, but because it was relatable. This is where public reaction begins to diverge sharply from institutional expectation. The monarchy is used to criticism. It is not used to empathy forming around someone who left. Empathy changes the equation. Because once empathy enters the conversation, hierarchy loses control. People stop asking, was he disloyal? They start asking, what happened to him? And that shift terrifies institutions. Now ask yourself something honestly. If Harry had been loud, hostile, or vindictive, how would the story have played out? Easy. He would have been framed as unstable, emotional, unreliable. That narrative was ready. But he didn't give it oxygen. Instead, he spoke calmly, reflectively, sometimes painfully, and that forced a different kind of scrutiny. Not of him, of the system. Because when someone speaks softly about harm, people listen more closely. They lean in. They start noticing contradictions. How an institution that claims compassion responds to vulnerability. How a system built on tradition handles deviation. How power reacts when control slips. This is where the monarchy's dilemma becomes visible. Respond and validate his voice. Ignore and appear cold. Clarify and reopen debate. Stay silent and confirm distance. Every option carried cost. And this is the point where the institution realized something too late. Excluding Harry had removed a buffer. Now, there was no one translating between the crown and the public in human terms. No one softening the edges. No one absorbing emotional fallout. Harry had done that work, often unconsciously, for years. And now that work had stopped. So when he began speaking from outside the system, the institution lost its emotional interpreter. That vacuum is dangerous. Because narratives rush in to fill it. Sympathy narratives. Curiosity narratives. Reassessment narratives. And institutions hate reassessment. Now let's talk about the tone Harry adopted. Because tone matters more than content. He didn't sound bitter. He didn't sound defeated. He sounded resolved. That's the tone of someone who has accepted finality. And acceptance carries authority. Because people instinctively trust those who aren't asking for anything. Harry wasn't asking to be restored. He wasn't asking for apology. He wasn't even asking to be understood. He was explaining why he had chosen distance, and why that distance was necessary. That framing flipped the power dynamic. Suddenly, the institution wasn't withholding belonging. Harry was declining it. And that inversion